Today we are trying to learn about Buddhism. Before starting, it is humble request to press the subscribe button and press the icon. The history of Buddhism is a rich and complex narrative that spans over 2.5 millennia. Here is an overview of the key developments and periods in the history of Buddhism. Prehistoric origins. While Buddhism was founded by Siddhartha Gautama in the 6th century BCE, it emerged from the spiritual and philosophical context of ancient India, influenced by various religious and philosophical traditions of the time. Life of Siddhartha Gautama. Siddhartha Gautama, also known as the Buddha, the Awakened One, was born in Lumbini, modern-day Nepal, in the 6th century BCE. He attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, India, and spent the rest of his life teaching the Dharma, his teachings, to followers. Early Buddhist councils. After the Buddha's death, his teachings were orally transmitted by his disciples. The first Buddhist council was convened shortly after his death to recite and codify his teachings. Subsequent councils were held to address doctrinal disputes and establish the Theravada and other Buddhist traditions. Spread of Buddhism in India. Buddhism gained popularity and royal patronage in India. During the reign of King Ashoka, 3rd century BCE, the Mauryan emperor, Buddhism spread throughout the Indian subcontinent and beyond. Ashoka also erected edicts and pillars inscribed with Buddhist teachings. Formation of Buddhist schools. Over time, different schools of Buddhism emerged, including Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, each with distinct interpretations of the Dharma and practices. Spread beyond India. Buddhism began to spread beyond India, reaching Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and East Asia, including China, Korea, and Japan. The transmission often involved the translation of Buddhist scriptures into local languages. Decline in India. By the 12th century CE, Buddhism had declined in its land of origin, mainly due to a combination of factors, including Hindu resurgence, political changes, and the Islamic conquest of India. Tibetan Buddhism. In Tibet, Buddhism became a dominant religious tradition. It integrated elements of Bon, the indigenous religion, and developed distinctive practices and lineages. Buddhism in Southeast Asia. Theravada Buddhism remained prominent in countries like Sri Lanka, Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos. Buddhism in East Asia. China became a major center of Buddhist activity, with the introduction of various Buddhist schools, including Zen, Chan, Pure Land, and Tiantai. Vajrayana Buddhism. Vajrayana, also known as Tantric or Esoteric Buddhism, became influential in Tibet and the Himalayan regions. Modern revival. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Buddhism experienced a revival in many countries, including Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. Western interest in Buddhism also grew, leading to the establishment of Buddhist communities outside Asia. Contemporary Buddhism. Buddhism continues to evolve in response to the challenges and opportunities of the modern world. It remains a major world religion with millions of adherents globally. Please subscribe, like, share, and comment, and don't forget to press the bell icon. Buddhism is a major world religion with a rich set of beliefs and principles. Some of its core beliefs include the Four Noble Truths. These are the foundational teachings of Buddhism. They state that life is suffering. Dukkha. Suffering has a cause. Craving and attachment. Suffering can be eliminated, and there is a path to the cessation of suffering. The Eightfold Path. This is a practical guide to living a more enlightened and virtuous life. It consists of 8 interconnected principles, including right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Reincarnation and karma. Buddhists believe in the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, samsara, based on karma, the law of moral cause and effect. One's actions in this life affect their future lives. Nirvana, enlightenment. The ultimate goal of Buddhism is to attain nirvana, which is a state of liberation from suffering and the cycle of rebirth. It is achieved by gaining insight and wisdom into the nature of reality. The Three Jewels. Buddhists take refuge in the Three Jewels: the Buddha, the teacher, the Dharma, the teachings, and the Sangha, the community of followers. Anatta, Anatman. Buddhism teaches the concept of anatta, which means the absence of a permanent, unchanging self. It asserts that the self is an ever-changing, interconnected phenomenon. Compassion and loving kindness. Buddhism emphasizes compassion for all sentient beings and the practice of loving kindness, metta, to cultivate a benevolent and open heart. Meditation. Meditation is a central practice in Buddhism. It helps individuals develop mindfulness, concentration, and insight to better understand the nature of reality and the mind. The middle way. Buddhism encourages finding a balance between extremes and avoiding attachment to worldly pleasures or self-mortification. Let's discuss various school of thoughts of Buddhism, so are moving forward after you press the subscribe button and press the bell icon. Buddhism has various schools and traditions, each with its own interpretations and practices, but these core beliefs are shared among most Buddhists and provide the foundation for the religion's ethical and spiritual teachings. Tibetan Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism is a specific school or tradition of Buddhism that originated in Tibet and the surrounding regions. It is often referred to as Vajrayana Buddhism, and it has distinct characteristics that set it apart from other forms of Buddhism, including Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism. Here are some key differences between Buddhism as a broader category and Tibetan Buddhism. Geographical origin. Buddhism originated in India with the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha. Tibetan Buddhism, on the other hand, developed in the Himalayan region, including Tibet, Nepal, Bhutan, and parts of northern India. Scriptures and texts. While all forms of Buddhism share common scriptures like the Tripitaka, Pali Canon, and Mahayana Sutras, Tibetan Buddhism has its own unique set of texts, including the Tibetan Kangyur and Tengyur. Lineage and sects. Tibetan Buddhism is divided into various sects, each with its own lineage of spiritual teachers. The four major schools of Tibetan Buddhism are Nyingma, Kagyu, Sakya, and Gelug, each with distinct teachings and practices. Other forms of Buddhism, such as Theravada and Mahayana, have their own sects and lineages. Tantric practices. Tibetan Buddhism is known for its emphasis on tantric practices, which involve complex rituals, meditation, and the use of mantras and mandalas. These practices are less prominent in other forms of Buddhism. Spiritual leaders. Tibetan Buddhism places significant importance on spiritual leaders and reincarnate lamas, such as the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama. These figures hold a central role in guiding the tradition. In contrast, other forms of Buddhism do not have an equivalent hierarchical system. Iconography and deities. Tibetan Buddhism features a rich array of deities, often depicted in intricate artwork and thangkas. These deities are an integral part of the tradition and play roles in meditation and practice. Other Buddhist traditions have their own pantheon of deities but may emphasize them to varying degrees. Monastic life. Monasticism is common in all forms of Buddhism, including Tibetan Buddhism. Monks and nuns follow a strict code of conduct and are central to the preservation and dissemination of the Buddhist teachings. Cultural and shamanistic elements. Tibetan Buddhism has absorbed elements from the pre-Buddhist Bon religion and incorporates some shamanistic practices. This has led to unique rituals and ceremonies not found in other Buddhist traditions. Theravada Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism, also known as the Doctrine of the Elders, is one of the two major branches of Buddhism, the other being Mahayana Buddhism. It has a distinct set of beliefs and principles that characterize its tradition. We already discussed the main points, now we are just describing the difference. Impermanence, anicca. Theravada Buddhism emphasizes the impermanence of all things. Nothing is permanent, and all conditioned phenomena are subject to change. The three marks of existence. These are impermanence, anicca, suffering, dukkha, and no self, anatta. Pali Canon. Theravada Buddhism relies on the Pali Canon, Tripitaka, as its primary scripture, which contains the teachings attributed to Gautama Buddha. Monastic life. The monastic community, consisting of monks, bhikkhus, and nuns, bhikkhunis, plays a central role in preserving and practicing Theravada Buddhism. Monks and nuns follow a strict code of conduct. Mahayana Buddhism. Chinese Buddhism and Japanese Buddhism are both part of the broader Mahayana Buddhist tradition, but they have developed distinct characteristics and practices due to their respective cultural contexts. Cultural and historical influence. Chinese Buddhism has a longer history, as Buddhism was first introduced to China from India around the 1st century CE. Japanese Buddhism was influenced by Chinese Buddhism but developed its unique features, especially during the Heian period, 794-1185 CE, and Kamakura period, 1185-1333 CE. Schools and sects. Both countries have a variety of Buddhist schools and sects, but the major schools in Chinese Buddhism include Chan, Zen in Japanese, Pure Land, and Tiantai, Tendai in Japanese. In Japanese Buddhism, Zen, Chan, Pure Land, Shingon, and Nichiren are significant. Emphasis on meditation. Chinese Buddhism, especially the Chan, Zen, tradition, places a strong emphasis on meditation as a means of attaining enlightenment. Japanese Zen Buddhism also emphasizes meditation but has its own unique approach and practices. Rituals and ceremonies. Japanese Buddhism is known for its elaborate rituals and ceremonies, including those associated with ancestor veneration, funerals, and festivals. Chinese Buddhism also has rituals but may have a different style and focus. Sectarian diversity. Japanese Buddhism has a more pronounced sectarian diversity due to the influence of various Buddhist schools and the syncretism of indigenous Shinto beliefs. Chinese Buddhism has its own diversity but tends to be more unified in certain respects. Sutra and textual emphasis. Chinese Buddhism has a strong emphasis on the study of Buddhist texts, especially the Mahayana sutras. Japanese Buddhism also values sutra study but may prioritize ritual and meditative practices more. Esoteric Buddhism. Japanese Buddhism has a strong esoteric tradition through the Shingon and Tendai sects, which emphasize complex rituals, mantras, and mandalas. Chinese Buddhism also has esoteric elements but may not be as prominent. Influence of Shinto. Japanese Buddhism has incorporated elements of the indigenous Shinto religion, resulting in a unique fusion of Shinto and Buddhist practices. Chinese Buddhism does not have this Shinto influence. Temple architecture and design. Japanese Buddhist temples often have distinctive architectural features and design elements, including Zen rock gardens and Shingon pagodas. Language and scriptures. Chinese Buddhism relies on classical Chinese and the Chinese Buddhist canon. Japanese Buddhism uses classical Chinese for some texts but also has its own canon and scriptures in classical Chinese and Japanese. Human creation myths. The most interesting thing that any sect of Buddhism doesn't care how human created, they just believe they are part of greater scheme and thing and work for to become the part of it again.